A while back, I was contacted by a woman named Diane Devereaux, aka the Canning Diva, who asked if I'd be interested in receiving one of her cookbooks to try out some of the recipes. Well, in the time since, I've gotten to know Diane, and in fact, I did an interview with her on this channel a few months ago. More recently, Diane reached out to me again and asked if I'd be interested in getting a copy of her latest book, which is another book chock full of recipes for canning all sorts of things. I said absolutely, and so she sent me her latest book called Meals in a Jar by Diane Devereaux. And it's taken me longer than I thought it would to get around to doing it, but today I'm going to be making and canning one of the recipes from this book. And there's an awful lot of stuff in here, but the one that spoke to me on this particular occasion is the Asian style pepper steak, which is pretty much a bunch of beef thinly sliced mixed with lots of green bell pepper. We make a sauce, we add some other flavorings, we can the whole thing up. After the jars have completely cooled, I'll be popping one of them open to make the dish, or rather heat the dish up and give it a try. So there it is right there, page 80, pepper steak. And as much as I have a hard time not tinkering with recipes, I'm going to make it exactly as it's laid out in this book without changing a thing about it. I'm not going to add anything, subtract anything, change any proportions or quantities. I'm going to make it true to Diane's recipe and see how it comes out. So let's get into it and start making this big old batch of Asian style pepper steak. And the first thing we need to do is a little prep work, and I'll start by chopping up my green peppers. For this batch, we need 5 cups of green peppers, which is going to work out to be somewhere between 4 and 5 green peppers. So I'll just cut them open, slice out the seeds and the pith, and just give them a pretty standard dice. Nothing too crazy or elaborate here, just taking some whole green peppers and chopping them up into some smaller pieces. And next up is our green onion. I'm just going to chop up the green and most of the white parts of all these green onions until I have 2.5 cups, which is somewhere between 2 and 3 whole bunches of green onion. Next, I need to mince up 5 tablespoons of fresh ginger, though because I prefer to use my microplane grater thingy, I don't need quite 5 tablespoons, but I'll just grate until I feel like I've gotten about 5 tablespoons worth had it been minced instead of grated. And then our garlic. I'll go ahead and use the garlic press to crush up somewhere about 5 tablespoons of garlic. Now let's take a look at the meat that makes up the beef component of our pepper steak. The recipe calls for using 3.5 pounds of top round roast or flank steak. Well, I couldn't find flank steak at the store, so I went ahead and got the top round. And I don't have to do anything too crazy to it. I will go ahead and slice off some of the thicker parts of fat that are on this thing because I just don't need them for an Asian style pepper steak. And then I'll just get to slicing it all up. What I'm going for is to end up with a big pile of pretty thinly sliced little bite-sized pieces of meat. And when I've got that top round all sliced up, I'll go ahead and make my marinade, which is very simple and consists of only 1/2 cup of rice vinegar and 1/2 cup of apple cider vinegar. I'll get that into a big bowl and then set in all that cut up meat. I'll swish it all around and make sure it's all evenly coated, and then cover the whole thing with some plastic wrap to set aside until we need it in a little bit. Now let's start making the sauce, which will be the main liquid component of this recipe. So into a bowl that's probably a bit too small, I'll pour in 1 quart of beef broth, followed by 2 cups of water, and the one part of this recipe that I'm a little apprehensive about, and that's the soy sauce, because the recipe calls for 1.5 cups of soy sauce, which to me seems like an awful lot of soy sauce. I don't think in all of my years I've ever made a recipe, even a pretty big batch of something, that called for that much soy sauce. So I'm a little bit worried that this is going to be way too soy saucy, but more importantly, maybe way too salty. But in fairness, I haven't made this recipe before, so I'll withhold my judgment until the end when we actually give it a taste. Finally, I'll add 2 tablespoons of sriracha, which is marked as an optional ingredient in the recipe. I'll give it all a thorough whisk until everything's very well mixed together. And now all our components are ready, and we just have to start packing the jars. I'll start with the cut up slices of marinated beef, and I'll just distribute all that beef amongst the 5 quart jars, with the aim of getting about 2 cups of that meat into each jar, which is what the recipe mentions. Next into the jars, I'll add in the green pepper, 1 cup for each jar, followed by a half cup of green onion for each jar, about a tablespoon of garlic for each jar, and about a tablespoon of that ginger for each jar. And now I'll just start ladling in that sauce. Diane's recipe calls for leaving a full 1 1/4 inch of headspace, so that's what I'm gonna do. And when I think I've filled them up just about to where they need to be, I'll use my headspace measuring tool and check them all out. And it looks like I need a little bit more liquid in a couple of these. Now that's looking good, so I'll go ahead and debubble using the other end of that headspace measuring tool. Just scrape down the sides of the jars a little bit, give all the contents a bit of a stir, make sure there's no big air bubbles trapped down in there. Then it's just a matter of wiping the rims to make sure there's not any sauce or meat or any other kind of residue on the top edge of that glass jar. And then I'm setting on all of my lids and screwing on all of my metal rings, making sure not to crank them down real hard, just finger tight. Now we're moving over to the canner and it's time to start loading it up. So per my canner's instructions, I've got the water filled up to the appropriate line, and I'll just start setting in those jars, making sure that they're not touching each other or the outer walls of the canner. Now on goes the lid, and I need to turn the heat on high and let the temperature come up to the point where the canner starts venting. And I can tell it's venting because there'll be a pretty steady jet of steam coming out of the top little vent, and I need to let that go ahead and vent for 10 full minutes. Once 10 minutes is up, I'll go ahead and set on my little weighted pressure regulator, which on this style of canner is how the thing regulates the amount of pressure inside of it. This recipe calls for 10 pounds of pressure, which means I need to use the little weighted topper with one of the little weighted rings. Now I'll just let this all heat up for a few more minutes until the weighted topper starts rocking back and forth. Once it's rocking in a pretty consistent rhythmic pattern, my processing time has begun. And for these quart jars, I need to process for 90 minutes. If I was doing pint jars, I'd go 75 minutes. Okay, the processing time is done, and I've let the pressure completely die down in the canner before removing the lid and leaving the jars in there for just a few more minutes to just kind of start cooling down a little. At which time, I'll remove each jar from the canner and set them on a towel on the counter. And of course, now I just need to leave them alone while they come completely down to room temperature. And over the next few minutes, I'll hear each lid start to pop, signifying a successful canning and a sealed lid. In fact, just as I've been moving these out of the canner, I've already heard 2 of them pop. Okay, it's the next day. These jars are obviously completely cooled down, and I'm gonna go ahead and make one of them for dinner. And because there's a lot of liquid in these jars versus the amount of solids, particularly after the solids cook down quite a bit, I think the move here is to strain most of the liquid out of the jar for 2 reasons. 1, so I can choose how much of that sauce actually goes back into the completed dish. And 2, having separated the sauce out, I can heat it up on the stove separately and thicken it up with a basic cornstarch slurry. So I've got all the sauce in a little saucepan, and I'll get that heating up on the stove. And I'll pour the solids, along with whatever other liquid was still down in that jar, into a skillet. Get that heating up on pretty low heat because it won't take all that long while I get my cornstarch slurry going and start thickening that sauce. Alright, sauce is ready to go. The beef and peppers and all the other stuff in the skillet is sizzling away. So I'll ladle in some of that thickened sauce till it seems like about the right amount. Give it all a quick mix, and we're ready to serve. And in my mind, the right way to eat this dish is atop a bed of steaming white rice. And I'll just spoon over my reheated pepper steak with thickened sauce. And while it's not exactly very meal in a jar of me to do so, I do have some of those scallions left, so I'm gonna go ahead and sprinkle some of those over top just because it looks pretty. And while I'm at it, maybe just a light sprinkling of some good sesame seeds. Now there's nothing left to do but grab a fork and give it a taste. You know, I'd been worried that was way too much soy sauce that I was adding to this recipe, but lo and behold, it came out really nice. I think it's a little heavy on the soy flavor for my personal taste, but it's not offensive or overwhelming or overly salty. The beef is nice and tender, and while everything does kind of cook down and do a bit of a mush when you're pressure canning, I can still definitely make out the individual pieces of beef and some of the green pepper. The flavor of those peppers really stands out, and I couldn't help but sprinkle a little bit of fresh green onion on there because it just makes for a prettier looking dish on the video. A little bit of white rice ties it all together, and I'd say it's a really rather enjoyable meal. If I had to offer one real critique of the recipe and thing that I might change about it, it's that I would add some sugar to it. In all of my experience making Asian style recipes, there's pretty much 4 things that you can put together that's almost always going to make a pretty good Asian style sauce. Soy sauce, garlic, ginger, and sugar. Often brown sugar, other types of sugar are also quite common, but you mix those 4 things together, maybe with some water to add some more volume to it, you're going to make a pretty decent sauce that works well with chicken or beef or whatever. And thickening up that sauce was definitely the right move, and it's thickened a little bit more in this pot as I've been sitting here shooting this video. And there's definitely a lot more sauce after the fact than what you'll need for the amount of the pepper and steak and whatnot. You could absolutely save this and use it for something else the next day. All that being said, I am very inclined to add a little bit of brown sugar to that sauce to use for maybe something tomorrow for dinner. And my subsequent jars of the pepper steak that I have to work with, I'm pretty sure I'll mix in some brown sugar when I go to heat it back up. But anyway, a very successful canning and quite a tasty recipe that I can add to my repertoire. And that was just one page out of the over 200 in Diane Devereaux's new book. So if you want to check it out for yourself and get a ton of new ideas for things to can, meals in a jar, etc., check out her website at thecanningdiva.com and get your own copy today. So that's about it for now. I'm going to eat the rest of this bowl of pepper steak before it gets any colder. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future canning and food experiment videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/GreatLakesCountry. Thanks for watching, and a big thank you to all the Patreon subscribers who continue to help me support this channel. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.